All right, good afternoon, everybody. We are delighted to welcome you to our final panel and our final session with our experts. And so we are delighted to have the brilliant chair, Francine Lacqua from Bloomberg, who will be speaking with our panelists to talk about influencing change. Influencing change. We have been here for the entire day so far talking about our themes of poverty, place, and power. I don't know about you, but I am buzzing. I'm like, okay, how are we raising 600 billion pounds to go into Doncaster, right? And there's so many different ideas that have come about, so much collective action potential. But ultimately, right now, we're faced with two different situations. The first is that for the public, like I talked about this morning, education is at the lowest on the public's radar that it has been since the early 90s. There are several other priorities for government, for the public, ranging from, we're looking at housing, we're looking at crime, we're looking at healthcare. But there's a huge disconnect between the public seeing the power of education in leading to positive outcomes across all of those different factors. And then the second issue that we're faced with, of course, as people have referenced today, is the instability of politics and of government. And so I think that today we want to say we've done a lot of talking, we have a lot of ideas, and we've got all the power in this building to make change happen. But where is the most effective place for us to be putting our energy? Because the circumstances are unforgiving, and we have to be really strategic with where we're going. So the panel will be focusing on that. And what will be coming to after the panel is coming to you to then collectively say, this is what we should be doing. And it's all of the content that we'll be generating before this session ends at 4:05 that the FEA will be taking away to work with you on in the next stages to direct our future direction of travel. So I'm going to hand over to the brilliant Francine. She's come off air at 10 a.m. I was saying it's amazing that she's still awake considering she starts at about 3 a.m. And we're delighted to have you chairing. So thank you, and over to you in the panel.
Great, thank you so much. I have to say I'm caffeinated and hydrated, but Tasha, I came in and she was like, the energy is unbelievable in the room, and it is unbelievable. So well done to everyone. I'm excited about the panel because I know you have concrete things about what we need to do to make it better. And as Gina was saying, this is a crucial moment for our fight for educational equality. So my panelists, Samuel Kasumu, former advisor for Number 10, Tasha, Bite Back 2030 Youth Board, Ravi Gurumurthy, CEO of Nesta, and Longfield, Commission on Young Lives. So first of all, thank you for being here with us. Samuel, you advise Number 10, so what you walk at Number 10, and how do you convince them? Like, what did you learn from all of your years?
That sounds like more of a question for you, Anne. But yeah, I worked as a special advisor, and I suppose what I would say is ministers and advisors have a very narrow bandwidth for many reasons. And so when you go into a place like Number 10, you usually only have 2 or 3 priorities. And they're usually the things that you're going to hear during a general election, bluntly. And so the challenge for most people trying to influence government is how do you find a way to get the room for them to I suppose, listen to the things that you're very passionate about. And I usually say 2 things. Well, 2 things worked for me. One was data, numbers. This is what I always understand, and also what a lot of my colleagues understand. Rishi Sunak's current chief of staff was in my team, and then they went into Treasury. So certainly when I was there, they understood numbers, and certainly now they're probably even more passionate about data and what that tells us. And then the second thing I would say is very important is recognizing where you fit. So I often found that people wanted to be this lovely term, critical friends. But in politics, it's very difficult to be a critical friend because politicians need to know that they can trust that you have their best interests, whatever that is, at heart. And so you have to really understand what role you want to play. Do you want to be an activist? Yeah. There is nothing wrong with activists. We would not have had all the progress we've had in our society today without activists. And if that's the role you want to play, then mobilize and do that. If you want to be a friend of an administration, that's a slightly different set of behaviors and skills. And I'm going to stop there, because I actually have no idea how long I'm supposed to answer questions for. I need to make sure I don't hog the mic.
That was perfection. Tasha, talk to me about some of your successes and actually how you got through them and what you learned from them.
Yeah, so I've been with Bite Back since 2019 when we first launched the organization. Just a little bit about Bite Back. So we're a youth-led organization that works to improve the health and well-being of young people. And what that looks like is running campaigns that address some of the systematic issues that we have within the food industry. And two really successful campaigns that I'm really proud about are the first one is the Free School Meals campaign. So that was launched by my colleague Christina during the pandemic. And we found that 80,000 children across the UK are eligible for free school meals. And so we were calling for the extension of free school meals over the holidays. And her petition got almost 500,000 signatures, which was absolutely amazing. And eventually the government did listen to our call and extended the accessibility to free school meals over the coming holidays. So we have continued with that campaign up until today because the government likes to backtrack. Will change their mind a little bit. So I do urge every single one of you to please do sign that petition, because you are helping out 80,000 children who perhaps rely on that school lunch as their one and only hot, nutritious food. And the second campaign is one that I spearheaded again during the pandemic, and it was calling on the government to introduce tougher measures to tackle childhood obesity. And so we're calling for 6 call of actions, but 2 particular ones were the 9 p.m. watershed, so looking to ban junk food advertising online and on TV. And the second one was to also what was the second one? Oh my goodness. The second one was to introduce mandatory nutritional labeling. And so out of that, I created a video calling on the government to listen to the voices of young people. I was, interviewed by multiple media outlets, and that again caught the eye of multiple, government people in government, as well as companies, and part of Boris Johnson's obesity strategy, he did include the 9 p.m. watershed. But like I mentioned earlier, government do like to backtrack, so you often find yourself in that place of you're continuously campaigning. And why those particular campaigns were successful is because they were truly youth-led and the voices of young people at the forefront. You were hearing stories about how young people experience the food system from young people. It wasn't an adult, speaking on the behalf of young people. So it really resonated with, everyone, the public, even like Marcus Rashford. He really related with the Free School Meals campaign. So again, so many successes, but I think it all comes down to just having young people tell their stories, giving them the voice that they deserve.
Yeah, and it's public perception, it's mobilizing, and it's energizing. And given your role as Children's Commissioner, now chairing the Commission on Young Lives, how do you do it? How do you set the priorities and then convince people to get it done?
Well, all of the things you've just heard, what I would say is it's very unusual for someone to come to you and say, tell me what I should do. Occasionally it happens, but not very often. So that huge persistence in knowing what you want, being authentic, and filling the public debate. That's the thing that I think gets people to a different place where they wouldn't naturally have gone there. Because if you've got something that's kind of day after day, week after week, we've had it to an extent with free school meals over the last few weeks. It's not got there yet, but you can tell it's moving. And really being able to capture lived experience and public mood. And the things that before being Children's Commissioner I'd pushed on most were around childcare and around Sure Start, and both of those had their kind of moments. But as Children's Commissioner, I guess the thing that I managed to push on most, I think, were things like mental health for young people and children. And there was it hadn't been talked about before. It was a set of statistics. The narrative was that, well, it's getting a bit better. But actually, I use data. I use the fact that, you talk to any family in the land and they will tell you, and any young person, that they will tell you that things haven't got better. And you put that together and relentlessly keep pushing for it. And it's unusual if it happens all at once, but actually being persistent is one of the, I think, strongest campaign tools you can get, because people hate it when you don't go away.
Very practical advice. Ravi, how do you do it? How do you enable push forward, and what did you learn from maybe past mistakes or things that haven't been as successful as you wished for?
Well, before I was CEO of Nesta, I spent about 15 years in government, and there was a couple of examples from that time which I think are interesting. One is the creation of the Climate Change Act back in 2008, and we were the first country in the world to have legally binding targets, and I think there are a few lessons about how that came about. One, it came about because there was a big party political race for the Green vote, because David Cameron at the time was trying to detoxify the image of the Tories as being nasty, but decided to go green. And so suddenly, Labour and the Tories are fighting for this Green vote. The second thing was that there was a fantastic report called the Stern Report, which laid out the cost of climate change as being about 20% of GDP versus the cost of tackling it, which was about 1 or 2%. And that economic argument about why this mattered and how it was avoidable really penetrated. And the other thing was that you had a cacophony of sort of business voices being quite progressive. And so suddenly we were in the Environment Department, used to losing all the battles with the Treasury and Number 10, but we had this sort of really fantastic context that we could then mobilize. And we as sort of policy entrepreneurs, if you like, could take advantage of it. And the second one was, I was involved in creating Every Child Matters, which, for those of you who don't remember this, it created the Children's Commissioner job, the Children's Minister, and the focus on these 5 outcomes. And I think one of the lessons from that was about how to frame arguments within Whitehall and to difficult audiences. I remember going in to see Tony Blair, and he went, "Oh, what's next?" And someone said, "Oh, it's children's services," and he went, "Oh." And I went, "Well, okay." And I sort of said, "Oh, that's great." And he went, "Well, it's not. I care about the issue, but I'm just so pessimistic about the whole issue and the lobbies around it." He was not a big fan of children's charities, if you remember. But one of the ways in which we framed the argument was about how this required reform, and this wasn't about continuity, it was about change. And I think sometimes you've got to be really savvy about playing to the political instincts and political strategies of those decision makers, even if it's a very traditional argument. I think the other thing about it was that sometimes external demands take ages to actually get picked up by internal decision makers. So the Climate Change Act was a Friends of the Earth demand. It was a campaign, and it suddenly became the right issue at the right moment. Children's Commissioner was a long-standing campaign, and I think it only happened for 2 reasons. One, we had a load of painful things we knew the sector wouldn't like forcing the breakup of social services, and also Cherie Blair was very in favour of a Children's Commission. And the combination of those two things, we need to do something popular with the sector, and Tony Blair was fed up of being nagged by his wife, meant this got some traction. So I think...
Yeah, and there was also some really bad, tragic cases. No one wants to think that anything came out of that issue, but it broke through in terms of public dialogue because people could see that things weren't happening well at the moment.
So Ravi, how do you pitch differently from the Prime Minister to pitching to? Who do you know who to go to at what level of government to go to?
Well, I guess who can you get to?
Well, I mean, this was actually this is a very interesting process. What happened was loads of government had become dysfunctional. Number 10 had decided to say, you cannot do any policy for the next 6 months. There's going to be a green paper team set up in the Cabinet Office, and you should come up with proposals for changing the machinery of government. So it's a very unusual time. But normally, you have to sort of get more people on board.
Yeah, I mean, the answer is multifaceted. Ultimately, if you've got the Prime Minister or a senior special advisor to be on side for something, you're probably going to accelerate the pace of the change that you want, but that is not always easy to do. Very passionate about encouraging people to build momentum. Even when I was in Number 10, I would say, look, because of certain challenges, it makes a lot of sense for you to talk to departments, talk to ministers, but also I always encourage people to look ahead. Where is the world going to be in a year or two's time? Some of the most influential groups are talking to the future leaders today. I remember one particular group would take very young political leaders on trips and essentially make the case for the policy area they're passionate about. And groups like that, doesn't really matter who the government of the day is, their voices are going to be heard. So you've got to be multifaceted. I remember Marcus Rashford and that campaign around free school meals. And that just shows you the power of momentum. We had no choice but to listen. Unfortunately, you don't really want politics to be determined by how people feel or just the momentum. But that's unfortunately how it works at times too. So it's a complicated mesh, but always invest in future leaders. Try and figure out where the world's going to be in a year or two's time. And that's where most of your efforts, in my opinion, should be.
And of course now, we've got the prospect of probably one of the first contested general elections for a while coming up in the next couple of years, which starts to make a lot of issues really quite live. So there's the opposition to talk to, who are setting out their policies. There's the, rising stars to talk to across the way. But I think, I do think as well that there is a changing mood towards, vulnerable people and children within that. I mean, the kind of debate that we've had over the last few days about social housing, for instance. I think the mood has changed on that. Things that, just happened even 2 or 3 weeks ago suddenly seem intolerable. Not that that's going to change everything, but I do think there is a mood changing. I think there's a mood towards a fairer, better way of doing things, and we should seize that moment.
So as a policymaker, as a policy convincer, when the mood changes, how do you capture that, Tasha? Do you have to, try and convince that actually they can make a difference and that this can really progress quite quickly? Or is it showing just about the negatives that we've seen in the past?
I think it's a mixture of both, really. I mean, looking back at the past often gives you an indication of where you're going in the future. So being reflective is very important. But I also think on the point of changing that public perception, at Back, we talk a lot about reframing, especially when it comes to the subject of childhood obesity. Historically, the narrative has always been, it's the parents' fault and therefore, the parents' responsibility to, sort out that problem. But actually, over the last couple of years, we're seeing that narrative change. Actually, it's a systematic problem. It's not necessarily, individual households. If we all had a choice, all of us would eat healthy food. But when we look at, some of the issues that kind of shape the choices of these families, it's often price, it's often accessibility and availability, and all of those are issues within the system that we can change. So I think changing that public perception, on one hand, it can be like, oh my God, this is such a huge problem, how are we going to solve it? But when you're speaking to young people, they have so much enthusiasm and so much passion, you genuinely cannot tell them what to do because they've already made up their mind that they're going to change the world. And so tapping into that energy, I think definitely helps with just transforming not just food systems, but just our society in general.
Ravi, what will you focus on from now until 2025 in terms of policies?
Well, Nesta is focused on 3 big missions, one of which is actually obesity. The other is sustainable future and how we can decarbonise homes. But the one most relevant to this audience is called A Fairer Start, which is about how we can narrow the achievement gap between kids on free school meals and the average at age 5. And for me, one of the interesting things is building the evidence for what works, because we'd like to run a trial, for instance, between giving families more money and actually tackling poverty versus investing in nurseries versus investing it in, say, parenting programs, and actually try to build the evidence base. Because I think 20 years ago, evidence was really, really powerful in making Labour focus a lot on early years, and we actually need to rebuild some of that.
Anne, what are you focusing on?
So the whole issue of poverty and the impact of poverty and disadvantage, not least in learning outcomes, where there's so many systemic things that need to change. But I think beyond that, the early years, big one for me, because getting that best start in life, and teenagers at risk. And again, I've spent the last year trying to draw attention to something which has often been overlooked. But I think part of the way you can do some of this is, be a bit quirky in where you go and how you do it, because you get noticed sometimes when you pop up, in some of the slightly more conservative newspapers or blogs, when actually, they don't expect you there. So I think trying to find ways of getting your message on all those things in different places is just part of that broadening and deepening.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think broadly, clearly in 2025, maybe before you'll have a general election and you'll have Rishi Sunak setting up his stall for his vision for the country, and you'll have Labour and other parties, but certainly one of them will probably be the government of the day. And so that'll be a really interesting point for the country. I think the future lies in more localism for various reasons. One, these are very tough economic times, and usually when that's the case, people want folks closer to where people are being impacted to have more power. And so I'm really fascinated with how that can look in the next iteration of this country. And I always encourage people to say, look, get involved and have local power, whether that means you're a local councillor, whether that means you're a school governor, or anything else. And so I think that's probably where most of my focus will be, and I think that's where probably most of the political leaders will be looking in the months and years ahead.
Tasha?
Like I mentioned earlier, the 80,000 children who are not eligible for free school meals, I think that's where definitely my focus is, especially Bite Back as well. These are children that are perhaps the most disadvantaged, that are likely to turn up to school having not eaten breakfast. We had a student share with us so she fainted at school, and she was given 2 apples and she ate one, and she said, I'm keeping the other one for my siblings at home. And to me, that's just such a heartbreaking story, especially for a country as wealthy as the UK. Like, that shouldn't be happening. And so for me, to making sure that we're protecting these young people, that they have the best chance to thrive when they're at school and just beyond academia, that's definitely where my priority is.
Tasha, you talked about a lot of activists, policymakers, especially young people, having so much energy. There must be off days, right? When a door closes and you're like, this is so frustrating. I don't know how I get around this, how I make this happen.
Yeah.
How do you get over that? How do you kind of, galvanize your inner energy?
So what you're talking about there is often referred to as like activism fatigue. So constantly as activists, you're, campaigning and campaigning, and, you get, the government might say, oh, do you know what? We're going to listen to you. And you're thinking, wow, we're making a difference. All of a sudden they backtrack and you're like, back at square one. And I think what helps me to kind of re-energize is 2 things. First thing is taking a step back and realigning yourself with your values. What that might look like is you might take a step back out of the space that you're working in and just do something different for a few weeks, a few months. For me, I went on Euroboard in Canada, so I spent the year there, and it was just really lovely to just speak to other young people who weren't necessarily passionate about the food system, but were passionate about climate change, passionate about just education, or just different things. So I think that helps. And the second thing, I think, is speaking to other young people. Energy is so contagious. So once you start speaking to another person who's even more passionate about, what you're talking about or something completely different, you yourself get a new sense of energy and you're just ready to tackle the world.
Ravi, how do you get back on track? I don't know if it's back on track or just kind of, continue pushing forward.
I think that one thing you've got to really hold in your head when you're doing these things is what you're really trying to achieve. What are your values and what are your interests? But you've also got to be deeply empathetic with whoever you're talking to, because otherwise you're not going to be very persuasive. And I think keeping that in balance is really, really important. If you end up being too empathetic and too going towards the other side, you lose a lot of the passion and fire and what you're about. But if you don't sort of flex a little bit, then frankly you're going to hit a brick wall. So I think that's the thing I struggle with, that hard-headed focus on what your interests are, but also empathy.
Yeah. Anne?
Well, I think, first of all, it's kind of that realism. It's usually not about you if you get knocked back, because no matter how far you get with your kind of, your demands that you're trying to get realised, there's usually lots more games in town, and the likelihood is the other games come along and steal your thunder. So a realism within that. But I think for me, I just always go and remind myself of why you're doing it. You go to those places, you talk to the people that are, experiencing whatever it is, that hardship. And actually, that gives you that both resilience, but also that drive, and also more evidence to go back and actually make that case. And I think it is, it's not just going to be a straight route ever. It's really about building that argument and taking people with you over time.
Samuel, what do you think the best asset for the Fair Education Alliance is, and how should we best use that?
So ask that question again.
So what's the best asset?
Assets. Well, it's always people, isn't it? And so finding a collective voice is very important. being quite clear about very specific things that you want to focus your energy on. You know, if you go to number 10 or whoever and you have a list of, I don't know, 20 or 30 things that you want, you probably won't get any of that. If you have 2 or 3 things that they can remember, that you can be consistent in lobbying for, then you're more likely to make more progress. So collective will. And again, I always go back to localism. It's not just about the big brands or the senior people. It's also about, well, how can you build a movement that really makes people want to pay attention? Yeah. And then also, like, again, the one thing I never do is get obsessed with people who are in positions of influence, because their time may be now, but their time never lasts too long, as you've all seen.
Increasingly so.
Ever so.
So have that clarity of vision. What is it that you want your impact to be? And don't worry if one person might not get it today, because they may get it tomorrow, but more likely than not, they'll probably be gone after too long.
All right, we have time for questions from the floor. Could I see a quick show of hands of how many questions we have? I know you have had great questions throughout the day, so don't be shy, and maybe I'll take a couple at the same time. So, one here on the second table.
Okay, good afternoon. Thank you very much for your insights. My name is Duro Oye from 2020 Change. My question is kind of about the title. You know, we're looking at delivering change in the current climate, but I wanted to know your thoughts on how not only do we focus on government and policy change, but then how can we bring in big business and philanthropists into this space as well? Because I believe they have power and sway to be able to make things happen a lot faster than people in government.
Great question on big business and finance. Maybe the gentleman there. I'm going to take 2 or 3 questions at the same time so we get through more questions. Yep.
Thank you. John McMahon from the RSA, Royal Society of the Arts. It's been really interesting to hear perspectives on how to influence sort of key decision makers in Whitehall, in number 10, for example. Really curious to have your perspectives on alternative parliamentary panels like APP, all-party parliamentary groups, select committees, House of Lords committees that can help to build cross-party consensus and draw some of the kind of oppositionality out of the case you're trying to make.
Great. Why don't we start with those 2 questions, because there's quite a lot to get through. Who wants to start on how you get big business and finance?
I don't mind.
Yeah.
So I think on both of those, so I've been doing a lot of work with the Northern Powerhouse Partnership. I'm on their board. In the North, there's 2 things that come out of that. First of all, regional mayors. We now have those, which kind of links to one of your points. But there you can see that a lot of the momentum really can come from business, because they are looking at their skill base. They're looking at, you know, levelling up, whatever that might mean in the future. And you know, they are looking at those they can go on that journey with. So I think there's a big momentum that doesn't come from Whitehall. It comes from both business themselves getting together and actually actively looking at what is needed and really taking that forward, but also the mayors as well. And I think that your question about the select committees, the select committee chairs can be really powerful, of course, and they're very, obviously, you know, really good to court. And Robert Halfon has been an amazing one at education, sadly now slightly locked away.
Why is that sad, that he's a minister now?
I know, but he can't campaign anymore.
Oh.
You can still send emails. Tasha?
Yeah, just adding on to that point.
Well, it's a great thing as a minister.
Okay.
Just adding on to that point, so at Back, we've just launched our System Accelerator Program, and that's looking at how we can get organizations and actual corporate companies involved in changing the system. And some of you may agree with this approach, some of you may not, but in true generation, Gen Z and millennial mindset, calling them out, okay? The amount of times that I have called out companies for not doing what they're supposed to do, Tesco's, you're not having a price promotions on healthy foods, McDonald's, your unhealthy food adverts are awful, literally calling them out on what they're doing. Companies hate that, and it forces them to have a conversation, because they'll come to you and say, do you know what, how can we move forward and how can we get better?
How do you call them out? On social media? Or?
Yeah, social media, yeah. Or I mean, if you're still into writing letters, etc. But social media is a great way because it mobilizes an entire group of people who agree with what you're saying, and so it applies even more pressure on them.
I think just on select committees, it's incredibly variable. You get some that are basically a bit useless and don't achieve anything, and some that are, happen to be incredibly powerful and influential. But the other thing is the degree of the majority and how strong government is. So in the New Labour days, when they had a 170 majority, frankly, MPs and select committees were not that influential at all. In coalition days and in the last 10 years, I think it's been more vibrant. Just on sort of philanthropists and academics and others, I think we obviously need to turn up the volume on why change is necessary and the cost of doing nothing, and that's partly why activism is so important. That context needs to be created. But we also need to create a context of hope and possibility and solutions. And I think that's what this group can do, as well as sounding the alarm bell about why it matters. But I think particularly on philanthropists and academics and thought leaders, giving a sense of hope so that people think this is a tractable issue. I, as a politician, am prepared to put my political capital behind this because I can get something out of it, is really important.
But how do you give them hope? Is it data, looking at other countries, other businesses, or how do you...
So I think it's always a combination of data, good evidence. So evidence really, really does matter, but also individual stories and ways of capturing emotions. And unless you've got both, I don't think you're going to get anywhere.
And I think showing what can be, I mean, you guys do that all the time, it's part of your work, showing what those solutions can be through kind of place-based work, and then just really amplifying it. Look, if we did this, we could do that, this could happen. So, and I also think, really giving people strong roles within that, if you like, and really trying to kind of, again, extend that agency that various groups can have around it. But solutions are really, really important because everyone wants, if you want change, you want to know what you're working towards.
Questions? Yeah. So let's do 1, 2. Maybe we get a third one in. All the way at the back afterwards.
Sorry, hi. My name's Grace and I work for the Access Project. Given the political context that you all kind of exist within, how do you think about engaging with people who disagree with you? And that could be on an individual level or on an organisational level, particularly as we've seen like such a hollowing out of kind of political discourse. Are you active in how you engage with people who have very different political views?
Hi, I'm Tom Gunter. I'm working for a charity called The Difference. I wondered, what's the best way, do you think, of building a case for change and advocating that can survive a change of government, or failing that, just a change of education secretary?
Terrible.
Should we take a third question so that we get through as many? Yeah.
Hiya, I'm Sonia Christensen from Challenge University Trust. Obviously, we're all here about education today, but I just wondered what each of you place the value on extracurricular education and the benefits that brings to young children, like, increased confidence, increased skills, etc.
Great, thank you, Samuel.
Yeah, I don't talk to anybody that doesn't agree with my politics. I mean, look, personally, I also am a pluralist. Politics isn't a religion to me anyway. And you'd find that behind closed doors, most politicians are fairly sensible, but you do have some who are very tribal. And unfortunately, they bring down the quality of the debate, and they're, in my opinion, on both sides of the political spectrum, responsible for a lot of the division we have in society today. So not good. And I think politicians should focus on competence and demonstrating that they can do the job well, not that they can be the most divisive. In terms of, I suppose, the other question around how you can influence, it goes back to APPGs and select committees. In my opinion, that's more of a medium to long-term play, because a chair of a select committee could end up being a Secretary of State, could end up being a Chancellor, could end up being a Minister, or a Prime Minister. And so when you're investing in those things, you're really investing in the future, in my opinion. Or you can have a Labour chair of a select committee who then enters government whenever that might happen. And so you have to just invest in the people that you think are going to lead in the future. In terms of extracurricular activities, I've got a 7-year-old and a 2-year-old, and my 7-year-old does piano, swimming, rugby, and a bunch of other things that really confused me because I'm always having to find out where he's supposed to be after school. But the reason why is because I'm completely sold on the idea of extracurricular activity, making sure a child has a much more balanced and enriched, I guess, foundation to their lives. I think it's also a priority for most leaders in government. The challenge is always around resource and the like. One thing I would love to see is the playing of instruments, or access to the learning to play the instruments, being more broadly or more available, more universally. So all of you, please campaign for that, so it's in both of the next. Well, I keep saying both, and there's a member of the Green Party sitting right in front of me. So all of the political parties' manifestos, please make sure playing of instruments is in there.
Yeah, no, on the question about extracurricular, I always get asked how I ended up with Bite Back, and it was through DebateMate. I think there's a couple of people from DebateMate, and honestly, the best thing that ever happened to me in terms of like building my confidence, I debated against people that do debating as like a subject. As much as they study maths, they study debating, and they had gone to the best schools in the country. And for me to be able to be in a room with them and then beat them at a debate, you can't tell me anything. I was like, cannot tell me. So honestly, that has opened up so many doors for me, but just that sense of like inner confidence that you are just as valuable as anyone else in that room. Honestly, just if you can do anything to encourage so many young people to just, enrich their school experience, absolutely.
All right, should we have a couple of more questions? I feel like we haven't gone to the back. There's many questions at the back. So,
hi there, hello. I'm Andy. I work for Rare Recruitment on our schools and universities programs. Now, my question was kind of based on that thing you said about mood changes, and how do we reharness the energy when the mood changes away from what you work in? So, for example, we work with Black students across the country, and we really, really found that, loads of people wanted to get involved around BLM, George Floyd, and then, when everyone was doing their black squares. Whereas now, that mood has moved away. How do we reharness that?
you can pick 2 other questions. I can't. There's 2 hands up.
Hi, Basra Maya from the Centre for Education and Youth. We are an education-focused think tank. I thought there was a noticeable absence in the conversation from the panel, and this is an absence that comes up in a lot of these panels, talking about driving change, which is talking about the role of trade unions in the labour movement, and thinking about the role they played historically, but also in the current climate, where you have several of the education unions having historic ballots on industrial action. And despite that being the case, when I speak to people who work in government and also people who work in industry, their attitude towards trade unions is typically either hostile or dismissive. So I'd be really interested to hear from the panel how they think of how the labour movement fits into driving change in the current climate, and how they think they can work effectively with government and decision makers.
All right, and 3rd question maybe? So we have a question on mood change.
Yeah, just following up on the question of mood change in trade unions, this is Ishkam from the National Union of Students. And thank you, Tasha, for talking about your petition. We're currently working on the cost of living crisis. And student power at work is kind of important to us, and the way that trade unions and labor unions have to work together. I do completely agree when you say that there's a mood change, but how do we and there are 21, I counted 21 occupations that are currently protesting on different days. Are we heading towards a general strike? Is that the way forward? How do we use this momentum and move forward?
Great, thank you so much. Who wants to
Can I answer firstly, why are the trade unionists at the back? Was that a choreographed, Gina? No, sorry, bad joke. But on a serious note, I mean, one of the first things I said earlier was you have to know what role you're playing. Don't try and be everything, because in trying to be everything, you end up being nothing. And I think unions have always had a very important role to play in holding government to account, to ensuring people who might not have a voice are organized, and there is a clarity in terms of the things that they feel needs to happen. I think the union's relationship with government will always be the union's relationship with government, meaning that there will always be some tension. And if there isn't tension, somebody's probably doing something wrong. But that doesn't mean it can't be constructive. And I say there are some people whose rhetoric may not always help, but behind closed doors, there are a lot of very mature people who are willing to sit down and engage with unions and vice versa. So I completely think, and people might think it's quite a strange thing for someone in my politics to say, that there is a very vital role for trade unions to play in making sure we continue to try and strive for a better future.
Anne?
So I think my kind of thread throughout all of those is around the voice and lived experience of real people and harnessing that, because when the mood changes one way or another, you can only kind of either, find a new way of bringing this to the attention of everyone you want to take on board your campaign, or indeed bring it to the fore quite quickly by having that real mass of evidence, real kind of groundswell. And be ready, I think, strategically. I don't want to make it too kind of feeling that we're ready for the revolution here, but, actually strategy is really important in this. So actually having lots of things going on in different ways is really important, in giving that sense that this is an issue that affects lots of communities. And I just think, just on the union point, I mean, one of the issues that I campaigned on, for many, many years was childcare, which was a real union issue because they knew it affected the lives of many of their members who needed to be able to work. So I think there are some, issues that align more closely with some of those things. But ultimately, I tend to agree that, there's lots of people have lots of roles in this. And I guess about getting that groundswell of securing that support is just part of getting this stuff over the line.
Maybe final thoughts from Ravi and Tasha as well as we're going to wrap up.
Yeah, I mean, just on the trade union question, two thoughts. One, it's one of the few examples where there is serious coercive power that does shape all the decisions in government. So I think it will have an effect, even if trade unions don't necessarily get the credit as a result. But I think the second thought on that is, I think with Keir Starmer and the Labour Party, you're more likely to see a kind of replay of Labour in government where they are defining themselves against that rather than wanting to look too cosy. And that's going to be a core part of their sort of political strategy. Now, that doesn't mean to say that behind the scenes you can't be influential, or you can't be influential in opposition by coercing them into certain positions, but I think it's unlikely to shift in terms of the sort of open position. Just on stamina of, how do you make campaigns not go out of fashion? I think it was such a good question, and anyone who's been involved in environmental politics or diversity campaigns just gets so annoyed when you're flavour of the month and then suddenly no one even wants to listen. I think it's hard to keep refreshing. How do you find the new iconic image? What I worry about sometimes, I used to work quite a lot in refugees, that the temptation was to keep ramping up the degree of awfulness, and you end up, I think, betraying who you are. You sort of, but you're forced sometimes into that situation because that's the only way you can get your message out. Sorry, no great answers, but just empathy.
Sorry, can I just to answer add to that, numbers. If you can have, how many members do you have? How many people do they represent? That is what will sustain any campaign beyond any moment. Don't worry about, again, who the minister of the day is or whatever. How big is your coalition? People will always pay attention to a trade union or whatever if you have the numbers, if you're mobilizing, and you have that clarity of vision.
Tasha?
And on the point about the mood shift, I can't emphasize the importance of sharing experiences. Like, no one can undermine your experience, no matter how trendy it is. So even when I think about, the free school meals campaign, 80,000, for some people it's just a number and it's so easy to dismiss. But once you start hearing the individual experiences of these young people, even if it was one person, unacceptable, and you definitely want to do something. So personal stories and experiences are important.
Thank you all for so much energy and so much insight, Tasha, Ravi, and Samuel. So with that, I'm going to get Gina to come up, and then we're going to come to the tables.
Phenomenal. Thank you so much. I'm sorry to say that I did receive a text during that time, and I looked at it, which is, I know, a no-no, but it was from my co-CEO, Sam, who was like, this panel is so phenomenal, and every other session was so phenomenal. So thank you. It was incredible and great food for thought. So what we're going to ask you to do right now is translate that into our next steps. And we have about 15 minutes before we're going to take a break, and that is going to be a 15 minutes whirlwind for you to get your thoughts down. And we will have the task of working collectively once we get that to then go through and be able to take that into our next strategic phase. I think a few of the things that have really struck me, I don't know if anybody's read the recent Stanford Social Innovation Review article about system change, but it talks about 3 different angles that are needed. The first is around programs. You need to do the programs to get the evidence so that you can be able to share that and scale it. The second is around policy influencing. So how can you best present that to policymakers and, translating it from programs to policy? And the third is public awareness. And I think it's really interesting that in focusing on how do we influence, which was potentially around how do we influence policy, it's really come about quite strongly that we need a better movement for the public awareness. We started out saying this is the lowest it's ever been since the 1990s. And so how do we galvanize the public to say education is the priority? Young people are a priority. And as Mayor Rotherham quoted earlier, Whitney Houston, the children are our future, and we have to get that. So we might need to bring that back as our campaign song, but I think there's a big potential in that. So we want to know where you think there's the potential and what we should be doing. So we're going to take 10 minutes right now, and would like you to focus on, the question, which you're not going to, there we go, which is going to be, where should we be focusing our energy? So I want you to be thinking about who we should be influencing, thinking about where is their potential. So where is their door that's already a bit unlocked, but we also have the power. We know that our biggest asset is you. And so how do we use that? Where do we need to just bang it down and be relentless and be continuous? And we might have a bit of activism fatigue, but we'll all be there to provide support to one another and help ourselves through it, because that's what's needed. Unfortunately, we have the data. We started today with the data, which is the data isn't good, and we haven't tried to make the data worse to tell a better story. It's just that the data's gotten a heck of a lot worse. So we have that, and now it's about saying, all right, how do we make this where we all have the fires in our belly to do something about it? So 10 minutes, you can, if you've been on your table for a while, I think you're all new ones, but if you've been with the same people, I encourage you to just pull up a seat with the people next to you, build those connections, and I'll come back in about 8 to wrap us up. But if you can get on this Menti and tell us how we should be doing our influencing as a collective going forward. All right, thanks. Thank you. So I hope you agree that that was a phenomenal panel and gave us some really key insights. I think we've got 2 different challenges ahead of us right now, which is where are we focusing our energy in the short term? What are we doing because young people right now are being left behind? And we frankly cannot stand for that any longer. And so how are we changing our behaviors? We're going to be talking about this in the last session. Amazing. It scrolled up way too quickly, but I think that's an interesting one. So here's our immediate focus. And then how are we, to quote Anne, ready for the revolution? I think this is the revolution. This is our moment. We started 7 years ago with 20 members. In 2022, we have nearly 250 members. This is our revolution right here. And so making sure that we're going into the next session with our action plans for how we're going to take advantage of that. So what we've seen come through are different themes that we should be focusing on, picking up on Ravi's focus on early years and making sure that everybody has a fair start, then through to how we actually galvanize the collective voice, and then I suppose, as Francine has said, there is one on Prince William as well. So I think it is interesting, though, to think about Tasha's example of Marcus Rashford. How are we really utilizing key figures to become advocates? Because it's not just up to us, it's who else we can get to amplify our message as well. So what I'd like to do before we go for a short break, before the next session, is to give our panelists a massive round of applause. You've given us huge insights. Perfect. What we'll be doing, we have our monthly overarching campaign working group. The next one of those is in the new year at the end of January. If you aren't coming to those, you should be. We have about 50 different members who are engaged, and it is a come when you can, happens monthly. And we determine what should we be campaigning on, and this is going to be a big focus for that group. So if you're interested in how we should be using this, rather than being on the other end of this, oh yeah, we're doing this, okay, I'm in. If you want to be shaping it, then that's a great vehicle. And our Director of Collective Action, Janine Hyatt, you can pick up with her over the networking. You heard from her this morning about the report card for how we take this work forward. So the next session is going to start at just about 13 past, so we've got a quick movement break. So I invite you to stretch, get ready. That is all about our takeaways, our actions, before we have our massive surprise at 5 p.m., and then that leads us into the networking. So thank you again, panelists. You've been phenomenal.